In this video, we're finally taking a look at the Hilleberg Soulo. We'll start with the setup, we'll have a look at the exterior as well as the interior. We'll talk about sizing and livability, as well as some tips for buying a Soulo. And finally, we'll cover what's probably the most important thing. So the tent comes with 3 poles. One is marked with red. This is the short pole. So one has a different length. The remaining 2 poles have the same length. And the tent also comes with 12 pegs. As this is the Red Label Soulo, and the pegs are V-shaped. On the Black Label, you get the larger X pegs. So the poles are pre-bent. You can see that especially around the endings here. So from here there are different things you could do. You could put in a couple of pegs that will make sure the tent fabric remains in place. So that makes it easier to set it up. I like to start with the long poles. And now finally the red pole. So this type of design makes it possible to set up a tent like this in very, very strong winds. As you can see, the guy lines are separated. There are 2 attachment points. One is connected to this sleeve and the other one will be wrapped around the pole. What this means is you can already use these guy lines to secure the tent. So that means that all corners can already have their guy lines in place. One thing I didn't like about the Hilleberg Steika, if you maybe have seen that video, is that these guy lines are connected. So that means sometimes the pole would be on the wrong side and then you wouldn't be able to use it. So the next part is probably the most time-consuming part. That's why it's good to be able to secure the tent already. Again, different ways of approaching this. The official suggested way is to go around the tent, do maybe 2 clips at a time. Of course, it depends on how strong the winds are. If there's any wind at all, that will all determine if this is necessary. Because this is such a small tent, everything is quite manageable and you can reach everywhere easily. So one thing I also like to do is to use some sort of elastic bands on these guy lines, because they do get in the way and they tend to get entangled in those clips. So that just making things easier for yourself when you're setting it up. Given the amount of pegs provided, you use 1 peg for both of the guy lines. But of course what you could do is get some additional pegs, so in case one does come loose, the other one is still secured. Okay, so now let's talk about the exterior design for a bit. The shape is asymmetrical. That means that this end of the tent is more narrow than this tent. This is also where your head and shoulders go. That's your foot end. So that makes sense. You would want to set up this tent with that end in the direction of the wind, because when you unzip the door, which is located over here, the vestibule still offers you protection from the wind. If you look at the Allak, they've done the opposite, which means this tent is more suitable for high winds. Next topic is strength and durability. This is the Red Label version of the Soulo. Hilleberg has recently introduced a newer black version of this tent, which is essentially the same. It just uses thicker fabric and thicker poles. If you're looking for a comparison between the Red Label and the Black Label, there's an excellent video made by Tom Henley. I'll link to that in the description. This being a Red Label is still a very, very strong tent. If you want to see how this tent will look like after being exposed to high altitude sun for a couple of months, there's an excellent video on that as well. You can check out this channel called India in Motion. I will link to that video as well. If we look at the construction, there are 3 places in which the poles cross. This is to increase strength of the tent and also the capacity for snow loading. You can see it's a bit more flexible over here, but here in the middle it's very, very strong. So now let's look at the door and the ventilation. This is the ventilation panel. There are zips over here. You can unzip this bit, and if you go until this marking of the storm flap, this is pretty much your ventilation opening. There's a loop and toggle over here that you can use to secure it, and of course now there's a gap. That's where the hat comes in. So the hat is always attached on this end, and there are 2 attachment points on the front. So this should now protect you from the rain while providing enough ventilation. Of course, this is a 2-way zipper. So if there's a lot of snow around, you could also use this door like that to enter and exit the tent. And you could undo this for easier access. In my experience, because of the clips, this isn't very easy to reattach from inside the tent. As you can see, maybe it gets stuck over here. So you could unclip it, but if you need to reattach it in the middle of the night because it suddenly starts to rain, you might need to step outside. And some additional features of the hat: there's a rain gutter, which is just a piece of fabric that will hopefully redirect some of the rain away from the vestibule, so it should flow in this direction. And then there's also this additional attachment point that you can use for an additional guy line. And of course there's a storm flap to prevent the rain from coming in through the zipper. So now let's roll away this door and have a look inside. There's a 3-way zipper over here. Most of the tent is just fabric. This is the mesh ventilation panel, which is also covered by fabric that you can unzip. And there are attachment points to keep them in place. So this is a 3-way zipper. When you unzip the tent, the door remains pretty much in place, unlike on the Steika. Looking at the interior space, I'm 6'4" or 196 centimeters tall, and I can comfortably sit up fully right in the center. There's plenty of space for that. This is obviously a 1-person tent, so there's just about enough room to get 1 sleeping pad in here. Although we've heard stories of this tent being used as a 2-person tent. Looking at the vestibule, the amount of space in here is quite a bit less compared to the Octo. As mentioned earlier, this tent is asymmetrical. That means that the head end is wider than the foot end. And you also notice that in the headroom. I tried sleeping with my head on that end and it's just too narrow. So that means that your door and your entrance to the tent is on your right hand side. This is something to consider maybe when buying a new sleeping bag. Most zippers are on the left hand side. So that means the zipper is on the opposite side, which can be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on how you look at it. I find it more fiddly to get into the bag when the zipper is on the opposite side, but it does allow me to remain the heat within my sleeping bag just a bit better. So looking at other features of the inner tent, there are some attachment points that you can hang things from, and there are 2 pockets on this end. The center zip of the inner door is also a 2-way zip, which is handy if you want to access your ventilation. One thing I really don't like is this gap over here. This is a three-way zipper. That means there's always a gap you can't really close. This little flap here will provide some wind protection, but bugs can get through it. I mean, what's the point of having the best no-seam mesh when you leave such a big gap? Okay, so let's now talk about sizing and livability. At 6'4", 196 centimeters, I still have mixed feelings about how well I fit into the Soulo. How well you fit into the stand will strongly depend on not only your height, but also the sleeping pad that you're using. With a thicker sleeping pad, you move higher up in the tent, and because this is a dome-shaped tent, the amount of space gets less. I found that if I move the sleeping pad all the way up, that will move the inner tent away from my head. What also helps is staking out the corners, as you will pull the tent ever so slightly, and sometimes just a few centimeters is all you need. Something you also should take into account is the loft of your sleeping bag. That could add a few centimeters as well. So let's talk about livability. This is obviously a one-person tent. It's a small tent, and if you're not used to that, it might take some getting used to. The vestibule space is smaller compared to the octo, but because this is also a fully freestanding tent, you could potentially stand up the bag instead of laying it down. What some people do is they will just put the bag in the corner. It of course depends on how big your bag is. Because of the tent's shape, the fabric isn't very close to your face when lying down as it is in the octo. So if you're worried about being claustrophobic in a tent, this might be a slightly better option. I can fully sit up in here, I can change clothes, and everything is within reach. When we close off the door, there is just about enough room for me here to move around, still comfortable. Obviously, I don't have a sleeping pad in here. If there was a sleeping pad in here, I would be sitting up just a little bit higher, which is still okay. When lying down, I can also sit up most of the time without touching the inner tent as I'm doing so. When you unzip the inner tent, there is quite a bit more space in here and it feels more roomy. One thing I don't like is that the footprint doesn't actually cover the whole inner tent. I got used to this tent pretty quickly and I do enjoy the coziness of it. If you're looking for something slightly bigger, you can consider the Alak or the Steika. One thing that didn't work so well for me personally is using this tent in really cold conditions. And that's just because I had much more gear with me. I had a very big jacket and a waterproof jacket as well. And I just had no way of storing it. Of course, you could bring some extra dry bags and set everything up here in a vestibule, but I wanted to have this space for my boots. Of course, there are also people that have been living in these tents for weeks or months on end, and they're perfectly fine. So it's up to you to decide if you'll be okay with this space. So now with livability covered, let's look at some tips for buying a Soulo. Not all Soulos are created equally, so it's important for you to inspect your tent before taking it out on a trip. The tents are handmade, so there can be some defects. One thing with the Soulo in particular to look out for is loose fabric of the inner tent. Not sure if you can see it, but there's some loose fabric over here that just seems to be stretched out. Go around the tent, inspect everything, make sure the fabric isn't hanging loose too much. That will affect how the tent behaves in strong winds. So what I did here to make the inner tent sit just a bit tighter is I double wrapped this toggle over here, which pulls it back just a little bit. Also did that over here and on the other corners. All right, so now with all of that covered, I think it's time to talk about the elephant in the tent. Unfortunately, we're out of time, so we'll talk about that in the next video. If you haven't yet done so, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.